you may recognize this image. So it's an image I made as part of a whole series that was formed from plants and other things that I found on my walks. And it was a way of connecting to an essence that I was experiencing in nature where I felt like I was being observed by invisible worlds. So this series formed as a way of tapping into the invisible worlds, which for me is really what an artist's job is to try and tap into the unfiltered versions of reality, which is also another thing that biohacking is. It's about trying to break down the filters of our everyday life in order to feel and see a bit more into all the invisible worlds. So this image and many others like it have become part of a repertoire of not specifically planning to make a specific image. I go and I find certain things, and in the process in my studio, certain elements from these pieces, they find their way into my creative process, and they form these faces or these structures or these animal symbols that essentially are coming from a place that was not planned by me. So artistically, that allows them to have a life of their own. And that is very, very important for me to work with an energy that is coming through me rather than consistently trying to kind of dictate how an image should look. Now, this time last year, Timu asked me, so we were, I think, 3 months into, there had been a significant development in technology. And I'm sure many of you are aware of something called LLM, large language models. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a branch of AI that has been introduced, and there are companies called Midjourney, DALL-E, and more lately, Stable Diffusion. So these innovations of diffusion-based image generation technology implemented in these platforms represent much more than a gradual advancement of existing tools. Now, initially, this really, really shook up the art world. I had a lot of people I know working within the arts who were just like, this is really gonna, this is actually really, really infringing on our space as creators, because suddenly anyone can just write a clever prompt or become a wizard with words and generate images that would have taken years to actually create with a practice. Now, there's a particular artist who I'm sure many of you know called Android Jones. He's a famous visionary artist who said this, which I think really represented what people were feeling at the time, was that I vacillate between marveling at what a significant technological accomplishment they represent and simultaneously wishing they did not exist. I'm still trying to comprehend the potential risks and rewards these kind of technologies represent. But the future rarely asks for our consent, and historically, art is a reaction to the environmental forces and factors we find ourselves in. Whether we like it or not, I believe we are experiencing the opening credits of a new epoch of art and artifice that will affect many facets of our life moving forward. Now, instinctively, as a nature-based artist, working with AI, especially with Midjourney, I'd actually been using Midjourney a little bit before last year's summit, and Timu asked me, would you mind creating me some images on Midjourney, like for my theme of my talk, which was the dark side of biohacking. So I kind of went away and I went into Midjourney and I put in a few prompts, and all sorts of different images came up. Mainly, Midjourney doesn't understand what a biohacker is, so it was sort of representing people in gas masks and suits, and it was like a field of what looked like sort of GM crops, and I was like, this is definitely not the atmosphere we're looking for. But my mind so for a concerted amount of time, I was quite anti this technology. I didn't think it was very efficient. I didn't think the resolution was very good. But there was part of me that was also interested. And I think most of us are interested in this story because in terms of AI coming and being part of our culture, we've been telling this story for over 100 years. There's not a single story that exists about AI where that it does not come and end the human race. So we have every reason to be a little bit fearful of this technology because we've been telling us this story in a mythological way for many years. But my mind was open to this technology by a particular artist who I came across recently, a guy called Marcus Kay. He's a multidisciplinary artist with a focus on science and generative art. His work explores the invisible and mysterious worlds of molecular biology and particle physics through generative models, assessing the implications of a world where nature and technology have become so intertwined as to question the fundamental difference between the artificial and the natural. Now, Marcus actually gave me permission to show a short clip of one of his works, which is actually currently on display in London, and I have actually put the link in the next slide. So when I first saw this work, I really saw the potential in generative art. I kind of couldn't quite believe how resolved and detailed this work was. And I actually struck up a friendship with him because his work was so interesting and it was so resolved that there was something I wanted to know. What was happening in his life that kind of gave him this little spark of inspiration to go into this world? And it turns out that Marcus has a disability called MECFS, which is a very, very powerful autoimmune condition. Now, this happened in 2019, and it rendered him permanently housebound and largely bedbound. He continues to create art and scientific illustrations and moving image within the limits of his disability. Like I said, he has a new immersive exhibition in London, which I encourage you to go and see. So not only did Marcos' work move me, but his story moved me as well, because I myself suffer from Crohn's disease, which is a powerful autoimmune condition. It's not nearly as severe as what Marcos is experiencing. But my sense when I have an autoimmune flare-up, I've often related that to having like a creative burst. There's some kind of a divine aspect which comes to you when you're at your weakest, when you're kind of it's almost like you have a kind of divine connection when you're in your most vulnerable position. And I often relate that to artists whose work I connect with, is seeing that their work that has most impact is actually produced when they're at their weakest. So, as regards to the conversation around ethics, around AI art, I mean, I don't know if many of you know, but these large language models are essentially pixels and data that has been collected from all over the internet, not necessarily with people's permission at all, and then transmogrified into some of these videos that you're seeing here. Now, from an ethical standpoint, I don't really resonate that, because I think if you put your images onto the internet, you essentially know that there's a potential of imitation and mimicry, and you're doing that because sharing is naturally what humans do. And this quote from Julian Barnes actually really connected with me, which is that art belongs to everybody and nobody. Art belongs to all time and no time. Art belongs to those who create it and those who savor it. Art is the whisper of history heard above the noise of time. So now we move into my own experiments in the world of generative art. Now, you would have seen some of this moving around throughout the conference. You've seen Ray doing a brilliant job of incorporating this into the stage. But by feeding my images into various generative models and giving them certain prompts that are generally based around biology or microscopy, I've managed to create a series of images which, in my opinion, are starting to tap into an essential part of both forms of nature as well as speaking to my own connection with these spaces that I've explored both through meditation and through psychedelics. So this one is accompanied by music. What I've started to do is create 2 or 3 minute videos which I then combine with something as a very resonant sound source, as a way of essentially creating a moment where you can kind of transcend whatever's happening in your life, just for a little 2-minute biohack, creating a video that puts you in some kind of a trance, that also allows you to imagine technology as sacred, which I think we more and more now we're seeing that this immersion of nature and technology is something that we are, as powerful human beings, able to guide. There's one particular subject that I photograph a lot, which is mushrooms and lichen. Now, lichen, I don't know if many of you know much about lichen, but it's around 1 billion years ago. It was the very, very earliest emergence of algae and fungi. We still don't quite know which came first. There's a lot of signs that fungi actually allowed for the emergence of the plant world. So I'm curious if we go back into a moment of sort of deep time and imagine what happened with these different what I consider to be layers of consciousness embedded in the worlds of fungi and plants. There must have been some kind of a coalition between these factors that have subsequently led to a proliferation of all of these things. Now, I believe we're at an absolute melting point with AI, but I believe at the moment, certainly on the creative front, we actually have the potential to create this same kind of coalition by working with the technology and actually really, really training it into both the awe and wonder that I and everyone here has for the natural world. So this is a good example of a piece of lichen. It's quite a simple photograph, but I've mapped it in a way that so lichen has exceptionally lots of tendrils and shapes and various fractal patterns that are absolutely perfect for my art. So this particular piece here it's literally just from a little small piece of lichen growing on the top of the mountain that I've photographed, and then I've put it through this generative model with. I'm finding working with the generative models is often about what words you don't use rather than the words you do use. There's certain things that I feel like I'm sort of in an incubator with all these incredibly precocious, talented beings that are growing in strength and numbers daily. So for me, this immersion, as someone who is a complete naturephile and who is quite likely to reject this emergence of AI art, I found a way to work with it, which I not only find incredibly pleasing, but again, it's a portal into creating a calm and coherent state of mind, even if only for a 2 or 3 minute incision into your day. My concern with the resolution quality of the generative models I'm using has actually been. Today I've been really, really happy with how they've looked on the stage. I was a little bit nervous and it felt a bit vulnerable to show what is quite early work for me. But I hope you've enjoyed a lot of what I've been showing today. So here's an example of, it's a very macro close-up of a peacock feather. Actually 2 different images. So in terms, I was giving quite biological microscopy and mitochondrial prompts to some of these images, and it's amazing for me to find what the technology actually understands. And because it has been rooted in scientific discovery, it seems to understand the world of microscopy much better than for example, if I wanted to turn the peacock feather into a landscape, for example. It would do something that I'm sure I wouldn't resonate with. But in terms of like actually climbing into the structures and some of the sort of vascular systems that I think most of us who've meditated or had experiences on psychedelics will recognize these worlds. So for me, it's proof that there is something in this world that I'm going to continue to work with and develop, because I see this as being an important step in our evolution. This particular piece was one of those incidents where I was given a gift, and it contained something that the prompt did not have, or it did not contain certain details that sort of emerged from this image, making me wonder whether there was, in fact, something divine in the machine creating this for me. Anyway, thank you very, very much. Thank you.